It's my pleasure to be back at USD. I have very fond memories of my time here, so it's great. And it's weird in a way because I've been back maybe once since I moved back a couple of months ago, and I'll be here 3 days this week starting today. So I'm going to get my full of USD by the end of the week. So it is really my pleasure to be here with Jane, and I've already told her she is really the star of the show. I'm the straight man, okay, for today. I had the pleasure of meeting Jane when I was at Target. We had, Target has a Techstars program. How many people are familiar with Techstars? It's an accelerator for startups. And Target teamed up with Techstars, and Jane was one of literally hundreds of companies that were recruited. She was one of 10 people. Her company was one of 10 that was chosen to participate in this program. We had a Mentor Madness event where all of the companies got to meet prospective mentors like myself, and it was sort of an immediate match. And what attracted me to Jane was, and to the market, her company, was that I felt like the term empowerment gets used a lot, but really this company is about empowerment, and it's empowerment for global entrepreneurs. It's empowerment for, they provide tools for companies that want to behave more ethically and sustainably, and they empower consumers to make the right choices, and that's going to be a big focus of hers. So I'm really happy to be here, and I want to thank, before I forget, I want to thank Denise, Dr. Diamond, and the Aller Center for having me here today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Let me get to my next. So I'm going to just give everyone sort of a grounding of what we mean by a sustainable and ethical supply chain. So as we use these terms throughout the rest of the afternoon, the rest of the session, you'll kind of have a sense of where we're going. Some of you may have different interpretations and meanings. That's cool. This is just the terminology and the way we're going to use it for today. And then I'm going to turn it over to Jane to talk to you a little bit about her company, give you a little bit of a deeper understanding of what she does and this book. And one of the reasons Jane couldn't be with us here in person is she is on the road every day promoting both to the market and her new book, which she will talk about in a moment. And then we're going to, you're going to see about 8 slides today. I'm not a big PowerPoint person, and having just left Target, I can tell you that's really difficult to be, because that's like 100 PowerPoint company. Everything is like 100 PowerPoints. And I said, if we can't say it in 10 or less, we really shouldn't be talking at all. So what we're going to do is I'm going to just kind of have a dialogue with Jane. I'm going to have some questions, and we're going to just talk back and forth about our experiences, and I'll interject some things that may have happened during our time, but really to get Jane's perspective on how do we empower those 3 key constituencies, right? Companies that are flying under the radar and have a hard time getting traction with large companies that are trying to behave more responsibly, and then the role that consumers can play in all of this. And then we'll turn it over at the last 15 or 20 minutes or so to your questions, and we definitely welcome your questions. In particular, if you encountered some of the challenges that we're talking about, we'd love to hear about that. Sound good? Okay. So I wanted to start with just sort of defining what we mean by a sustainable supply chain. And it's a supply chain that basically helps companies achieve the triple bottom line, right? How many of you are familiar with triple bottom line? Got to have some, right? Got to be more hands on that. So it's basically supporting the social, environmental, and economic goals. That these are not in competition, but they need to be in congruence with each other, right? So these are so not every company, by the way, obviously, is pursuing the triple bottom line. Not every government, in particular, is pursuing necessarily the triple bottom line, but that's what we talk about when we talk about a sustainable supply chain. And there's 3 key things that, in terms of a balancing act, that achieving a sustainable supply chain must do. It must help, on the long run, reduce costs, because no one ever wants to pay more, right? You all want to pay the same or less than what you've been currently paying. But also reduce risk to the company, risk in terms of suppliers who aren't responsible, or suppliers who aren't reliable, or in terms of things that could do damage to consumers, and has to be ethical. So there's those 3 balancing acts, right? This supply chain has to deliver the triple bottom line by being focused on costs, focused on risk management, but ultimately focused and most important, on ethical behavior. And part of the problem is we've seen this as a trade-off, right? We can't be ethical because it's more expensive. We can't be ethical because it's riskier. Having to deal with a lot more smaller suppliers is riskier to a company than dealing with a few large suppliers, right? So we've seen this as being out of balance. And so what companies like To The Market are trying to do is to bring that in balance so companies can achieve this. There are 4 pillars to the sustainable supply chain. And by the way, this is a definition I pulled from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, one of the top, next to USD. If Simon Kroom were here, I would say next to USD, one of the top supply chain schools in the country. But so this is, I'm pulling this from their definitions. But visibility is essentially being able to see everything in your supply. You know where stuff is coming from, right? The next order of that is traceability, in that I know exactly who, where, what, and when something was done to that product or process from the time it was an idea to when we put it out on the shelf. Now, this is really important particularly when things like food, right? We had a few months ago, the romaine lettuce issue. Traceability was critical in order to eventually identify where that tainted lettuce was coming from, right? So these are 2 critical elements of a sustainable supply chain. Visibility, and then at the higher level, though, traceability, knowing at any time who, what, when, and where in the supply chain. The next key element here, and really the most key element, because if you don't have integrity, if the company, you don't have an organization-wide commitment to ethical and transparent supply chain tactics, forget the rest of it. You're not going to get there, because you're always going to be in conflict with, remember that cost, risk, and ethical behavior conundrum. And if you're not committed to the ethical part, then you're always going to defer to either cost and or risk management as part of your equation. So you've got to have that commitment. That's the glue that's the ethical, that's the organizational cultural glue that makes a sustainable supply chain possible. And then transparency is about companies communicating to their stakeholders their behavior, right? So the first 3 things are really internal, what we believe in, how we can operate with that balance of cost, risk reduction, and ethical behavior. But then transparency is to let you know what we're doing and why we're doing it, and hopefully bringing you along in our journey. Okay. So success, I've already alluded to this, it's most dependent on the organization's commitment to integrity, right? The other stuff can be learned. The other stuff, there's great companies like To The Market out there who can help you with improving your visibility, with improving your transparency, with improving your traceability. But unless you're able as an organization to make that commitment, you're not going to succeed. And even in companies like Target, which speak to this greatly, this is a major emphasis for Target, is to enhance and improve their supply chains, make their supply chains more sustainable. You still see conflicts because not everyone across the organization has necessarily either bought in, or they're being evaluated and their performance is being rewarded on metrics that seem to be at loggerheads with what you're trying to achieve in a sustainable supply chain. And integrity comes from within. It comes from the people in the organization. It's not something you can get a consultant to come in and do for you. You have to build that on your own. The one advantage that startups have, and I work mostly with startups, is that you can bake this into your DNA right from day one, right? You don't have the conflict of the way we used to do things. And that's the challenge that existing companies have, is they have all of these legacy systems that they either have to change or, frankly, in some cases, blow up and start all over again in order to achieve a sustainable supply chain. Now, you play as consumers, we all play as consumers, a critical role in helping urge and compel companies to behave more ethically. I found this to be an interesting statistic. 2/3 of worldwide consumers now try, at least are saying, I think about it, making a purchase that will make a difference. But guess what? As consumers, we're doing the same calculation of cost, risk, and ethical, right? I'd like to do something more ethical, but it might cost me more. Or it's risky because I don't really know this product, and I don't know if it's going to be reliable. Is there going to be a replacement parts for this, right? So as consumers, we have to do our own balancing act about what's the right balance between cost consideration, risk consideration, and ethical behavior. In industries such as fashion, for example, people talk a good talk, and I know this specifically from other startups that I've worked with and also from our experience with Target. So people talk the good game, but when push comes to shove, people tend to buy the less sustainable product, if you will. So more consistent consumer demand and behavior is a critical catalyst, and that's part of what Jane's going to talk about today, and it's what I think part of the impetus for writing the book that she wrote was how we as consumers can really push the envelope forward, help companies, enable companies to take the step to behave more ethically and engage in more sustainable supply chain practices. Okay, so that's the end of the PowerPoints for today, and we're going to switch over to Jane and have her introduce herself.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jane, and as Helder shared, I'm the founder and CEO of To The Market. And To The Market is a business, a startup, that connects ethical suppliers of apparel, accessories, and home goods to brands, retailers, and corporations. And our big vision as a business is we fundamentally want to change the way that retail manufacturing is done to create a better outcome for people, for the planet, and ultimately, we believe, better businesses. And I came to this, to starting a business and to starting a retail-related business, really very much so by accident. My background was in foreign affairs, specifically in national security. So I started my career at the U.S. Department of State working on counterterrorism and ended up working all over the world. And when I was spending time in communities around the world, what I found was that there was tremendous untapped production capacity from ethical suppliers who were making apparel, accessories, and home goods. And they were doing so in a way that I thought had a much better imprint from a social and an environmental standpoint than traditional factories I had visited, partly with some consulting work I do, partly through, I had done an MBA at Columbia and had an opportunity to visit some facilities in China. And what I realized was that there was a real disconnect between these ethical suppliers and these brands, retailers, and corporations, where the brands, retailers, and corporations were having a hard time identifying and working with these maybe smaller, newer ethical suppliers, and vice versa. These ethical suppliers were having a hard time finding ways to get in front of the decision makers at these big brands, at these retailers, at these corporations. And so To The Market's model is really democratizing this process and helping to connect these ethical suppliers to these brands, retailers, and corporations. Before we go into Q&A, I just want to speak briefly to my book, which is Buy the Change You Want to See. It's a takeoff of the great quote by Gandhi, "Be the change you want to see." And I called it Buy the Change You Want to See because we as individuals and as individuals working in companies that have significant purchasing power have a massive opportunity to make change when we look at how we spend our money and who we spend our money with. And what I mean by that is retail is almost a $3 trillion industry. You compare that to what we as a country are able to spend in our budget on development, and that's something like $30 billion. So you're looking at, close to $3 trillion versus $30 billion. Quite a difference. When we are able to harness our purchasing power to support companies that are doing great work to either improve the planet and or other people, we can have a significant impact on, I think, the outcome of other people's lives and the outcome of the direction of our planet. So that's the thesis of Buy the Change You Want to See, and excited to talk to Helder about the business and about the book.
Great, thanks, Jane, and appreciate the overview. I want to drill down on these ethical suppliers. A lot of the ethical suppliers you work with are all across the globe, right? And there are people who otherwise would be invisible to a global market because of just a lot of the challenges that they face. So I'd like you to sort of touch on what are some of those challenges that these suppliers face and how To the Market helps them reach beyond their local businesses.
Sure. Well, the apparel and accessories industry is really interesting because 100 years ago, you and I might have 3 or 4 items of clothing in our closet. So we could have something that we worked or went to school in. We might have something that we went to church with, and then maybe PJs. And now the amount of clothes that we buy each week or year is something like 100 times that of what even 100 years ago we were buying. So that in itself is interesting because what's happened is as our desire to spend has increased on these types of goods, much of the manufacturing has moved overseas. And when it moved overseas, it started to be dominated and controlled by a number of brokers who had relationships with factories where the manufacturing was taking place, which initially was, of course, largely Asia and Central and North Asia. And because of that, there has been a bit of a monopoly or a duopoly in the sense that a handful of retail brokerage companies have really controlled which factories get access to US-based retailers, brands, and corporations. And because of that, many of these suppliers who have come along over the last couple of years or even the last couple of decades that might be fair trade certified, that might be GOTS organic certified, that might be women owned and operated, if they're outside of that sort of retail brokerage network, they don't have the same accessibility to participate in the supply chain of big business. And so discoverability is a big function of what To the Market does. So we are trying to bring what I would describe as non-traditional suppliers, meaning they're not on the sort of radar of these existing retail brokers, to retailers, brands, and corporations. Similarly, oftentimes some of these ethical suppliers don't necessarily have the same access to capital that a traditional big factory would have that might be backed by sort of a larger conglomerate. And because of that, they often are not able to participate in the supply chain of big business who might have payment terms that are anywhere from net 30 to net 90 of delivery of the product, which means that the facility would have to be shouldering the cost of an order, which could be millions of dollars or even tens of thousands of dollars, which to many of these facilities is significant, for months on end. And so without somebody that is helping these suppliers with the payments, meaning somebody like a To the Market being able to give them access to early payments, these suppliers often are not able to participate with major retailers.
Okay, thank you. We're gonna share a little moment that we had when we were mentoring, and I know one of the constant themes was this dichotomy between what people told you they wanted and then how they behaved. And so I want you to talk a little bit about what you've encountered in terms of those challenges. You know, what are some of the barriers that companies, because obviously you're offering this new solution, right? These new suppliers that otherwise they wouldn't be aware of, and that would really solve their problems in terms of trying to achieve their sustainability goals. But there's still these barriers. So I want you to talk a little bit about some of the barriers you've encountered and how you've tried to overcome them.
I would say the biggest barrier is largely around price. And we have found oftentimes that you can be very competitive with the existing pricing that another conventional facility might offer. But even if it is, 10, 20 cents more, just as you spoke to, buyers or merchants who are the ones who are making the decision about how many units of a SKU should go into a store and whether a SKU, meaning whether a product should even make it into a store, they are, as you alluded to, Helder, they are rewarded based on how much money they make, meaning their profit. And so if you're even, 5% more expensive, they are traditionally incentivized to shave off that 5%, meaning that they might want to go with someone else. And so one of the sort of barriers is until buyers and merchants within organizations, and this could also be even procurement specialists within corporations, until their incentives and their rewards are greater, broader than simply finding the lowest priced product and maximizing what you can sell it for, this will consistently be a challenge. So until they start being rewarded for choosing a facility that is much lower risk than maybe a traditional facility, meaning they've chosen a fair trade certified facility, or they're rewarded on the diversity that they awarded the business to a minority owned or women owned business. So until their criteria for success is broadened beyond simply getting the lowest price, that will continue to be a barrier.
Right, and that's a great example of what I was talking about earlier about organization-wide, right? That the ethical behavior has to permeate. And to that point, when you go and talk to companies, and we talked about this back in Minneapolis. What kind of screening criteria do you go through in your head when you're looking at a company and saying, are they really serious and ready to make this leap? What kind of things do you tick off in your mental checklist about, yeah, we can work with this company, or no, we can't? And I'm not talking about working with a company like Target or somebody like that.
Sorry, meaning like what kind of clients do we feel like we can work with, or what kind of suppliers?
What kind of clients do you feel like you can work with, and what are you looking for? In other words, what kind, or conversely, what kind of red flags might be there where you say they're not ready, they're not really committed to this fully, and we're going to run into what we run into, which is it always then boils down to price.
Well, one of the things that we learned while we were at Target in the Techstars program was just how important it was to ask as many questions as possible during those initial conversations with potential clients. So, those questions for us could be around, tell us about your existing manufacturing and sourcing efforts. And those very much differ depending on what brand or retailer we're speaking with. Asking questions around expectations for pricing, for turnaround time. What are they missing in their existing suppliers? Those are all valuable questions for us. Things that for our model, tend to sort of be red flags is when people do share that, that they are looking for the lowest priced always. We're not going to be likely the ones that they want to go with if this is about cost savings alone. Similarly, if folks have unrealistic turnaround times, we have actually very fast turnaround times. And when I say turnaround times, I mean the time at which somebody in a retailer would say, we would like to order this product, and the expectation for getting that product on the floor. There are certain turnaround times that are realistic and others that are not. And they're not unless you end up paying just an insane amount of overtime, which can very quickly get into unethical labor practices that we can't be a part of and supporting. And so those are all valuable questions for us to ask in that sort of discoverability phase of talking to a client.
Okay. Talk a little bit, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but talk a little bit more about what specifically you do that helps enhance traceability and transparency for the company, your client companies.
Sure. One of the stories that I jokingly tell, although it's completely a true story, is I'm an avid Domino's pizza orderer.
I would have never guessed that, but go ahead.
You what?
I would have never guessed that, Jane, but go ahead. I'll still continue to mentor you despite that. No, go ahead.
I ordered and ate a lot of pizza during Techstars, as it turned out, when I got on the scale. But one of the things that was fascinating to me when I got in the retail industry was the fact that I could pay $10 for a pizza and have more visibility into where my pizza was in production than most buyers can paying $100,000, $1 million order, and not knowing where their product is in production, necessarily which facility is making it, and whether that product will be delivered on time. So that was a really interesting learning lesson for me, and one that I think as the next gen of buyers are having more and more power, they're saying, this is an unacceptable practice that I would place an order 9 months in advance, and then it would sort of go into this black hole, and I just hope that it lands at the right time. And so to the markets, the way that we work is we try to provide transparency across the process, meaning we try to provide transparency when we're giving our clients options on who can potentially make their product. Meaning if Dillard's comes to the market and says, we're interested in this product being manufactured, we can say, well, you can have X facility that's fair trade certified and GOTS organic certified make it, or you can have Y facility, which is a women owned and operated facility. So giving them transparency at the start of who might even participate in making their product, all the way to giving them information in process on where it is in production, to ultimately on delivery, not only delivering the product, but also delivering information, both copy, meaning text, and imagery on, again, who made that product, how it was made, and that then allows our client to potentially use that information to transmit to their consumers what the supply chain is of that product.
Okay. One of the things I think you encountered at Target, because obviously Target is being a mass merchant, there's all these different verticals, right? Is that some industries, some verticals are more ripe for change than others. So in your experience, where is the traction right now, and why do you think that's the case?
Well, I think when we think about sort of conscious consumerism and having a transparent supply chain, I think, the food and beverage space is the most advanced. And the reason I think that's the case is I think of the way that we as individuals prioritize based on how significantly it impacts us. So it's sort of like an ego-driven dynamic, meaning things that are going in our body are things that we care most about. I would say beauty is behind. So number 2, food and beverage. And I think it sits there because it's things that we're putting on our body and it's being absorbed by our body. Third is fashion, because it's touching our skin. It's not being absorbed the same way that beauty is, but it's nonetheless touching our skin. And so it's certainly, I would say the food and beverage space is a solid 5 to 10 years ahead of fashion, where we can find mass brands at very price accessible price points that are offering things like organic, which is great. And it's a shift. So the students who are in college now, when I was in college, organic was not readily available by any stretch of the imagination. The idea of a farm to table restaurant was a total sort of anomaly. Like it just wasn't, there wasn't the same culture around us prioritizing and being potentially willing to pay a premium for understanding, who grew the vegetables, how was this cow raised, were there hormones used, etc. That's a real new dynamic. And so I think fashion is following the footsteps where we're beginning to see the use of more certifications that are prominent in the food and beverage space, like organic, like fair trade, more storytelling on where did this product come from, how was it made, who did it touch or empower. And that's really exciting for me to see.
What's interesting about the top three that you listed is they all have a high degree of consumer engagement, right? Consumers take a lot of time thinking about considering their choices. So that's a segue to talk a little bit about how exactly you think consumers can, and you alluded to a little bit earlier talking about your book, but maybe some tips on how consumers can help drive this change that we say we want to see.
I often allude or sort of compare rather becoming a more conscious consumer as being similar to deciding that you want to eat more healthily. And I make that comparison because I think there are ways to approach it that are more effective than others. So just as if I decided that I wanted to be more healthy, it would probably not be effective in the long term for me to say, okay, I'm never eating fat again, and I'm cutting out all sugar, and I'll never have processed food again. There may be folks who are capable of doing that. Most folks I know, including myself, are not. And so what I recommend on being a conscious consumer, much like making healthy choices when you're eating, is to start sort of with one category. And that category can very much so depend on your own spending habits, your own lifestyle. That could be your groceries. That could be the food that you buy, the coffee you buy, the gifts that you buy, the apparel you buy. And you pick that one category and you decide to research that category. Meaning, if I decide I want to start wearing more fashion brands that I feel comfortable with their supply chain, I could go on the internet and do some research on what are fashion brands that are fair trade certified, or whatever is sort of important to me. It could be eco-friendly. It could be that they're making their product in the USA, but be your own Sherlock Holmes. Get online, do some research into that category, pick a handful of brands that you feel like are worthy of supporting, and then pursue. We've all heard the word boycott, right? I'm going to boycott this brand. Well, I like to say boycott, meaning that you're going to make a commitment that you want to spend more money of your sort of allocated budget for that category with those types of brands than not. So pick the category, do the research, make the commitment. And I think, starting there, regardless of your budget, is a great place.
Okay, great. I would love to turn it over to the audience now. I think you got a pretty good overview.
Thanks, Jane, for the nice introduction. So I have two questions for you. The first one is, so I heard a lot about the goal and the specific target industries and the different areas you want to cover. Can you explain a bit more on the technologies that you're using? So something like, are you looking into like NFC or blockchain or anything like that? So how would you trace some of the things that you're talking about? And the second one is a simple, what would be a very good simple example or use case that you see as the company that would be like working right now at Target? So like one good example of one supply change that they made.
So as far as the technology, there is a lot of conversation about blockchain. I have seen some promising pilots. I think we're very far away from blockchain being used prolifically in the retail industry. I could be wrong, but I am sort of less bullish about blockchain in the fashion industry as I am in seeing it being used in other commodities, or in commodities, for example. That said, there are things that there are a number of technologies that are being deployed that I think are bringing increased transparency, and some of them are not particularly wildly unique. They just haven't been fully applied to the retail manufacturing industry. And so, for example, the idea of us providing more robust vetting of our suppliers, that's, plug and play technology that we're using for the vetting process, the reference checking process, and then the validation process, which is essentially, validating that their certifications are up to date, things like that. That's not necessarily, literally rocket science, but it is applying connectivity and technology into this industry in a way that hasn't been readily used in the past. Similarly, To The Market has a dashboard for our clients that transmits information on, again, who made the product and how it's made. And there's, nothing wildly unique about the technology that allows us to present that information. Again, it just hasn't been applied to the retail industry. As per your question of, can you give an example of a company that's doing really interesting work? I have the pleasure of serving on the advisory board for responsible sourcing for a major holding company called VF Corporation. And VF owns Wrangler, Vans, Timberland, North Face, a number of sort of iconic American brands. And VF, over the last couple of years, has done a really beautiful job of making a commitment to look at their existing suppliers and really dig deep on identifying which suppliers are not in compliance with sort of international standards on, either environmental footprint or labor footprints. And so I've watched as they have applied a number of sort of new standards, whether it's an industry term called the Higg Index, which is literally like a internal measuring tool to see how sort of environmentally friendly and sort of socially compliant a facility is, to see more and more certifications being requirements within their supply chain. And so I would say anyone who likes Vans, who likes Wrangler, who likes Timberland, who likes North Face, you should feel confident that those are being made in a way that really respects both the planet and people.
Hi, Jan. My name's Daniel. I'm a professor here. I really admire what you're doing, and I have two questions just out of my curiosity of your business. First, we know there are like fair trade. You're well aware of those organizations setting on standard for, generally speaking, sustainability. So I'm just curious, is there a company taking this kind of approach by setting on standard, or on the other hand, you're more like, we provide you a monitor, a dashboard, and clients, you decide what you are going to monitor? That's my question. So how do you approach that? Second question is, once you connect a client with a sustainable supplier, do you monitor the supplier to make sure that they are in compliant going forward? Because for your client, let's say, just making it up, say Target may work with hundreds of suppliers. They may not have the capability to monitor or audit. So how does it work? Thank you.
Sure. So for your first question on whether there is sort of a broadly accepted certification in the retail industry, if something is ethically made, the answer is no, there's not. And that is a real challenge, because you now have disparate efforts that are competing sometimes to be the certification. So there are some, more and more I'm seeing people use fair trade certified in the fashion industry, which has of course been, the fair trade movement has been around for a while. I haven't seen it very present in the fashion industry until more recently. So you can see on Patagonia's website, fair trade sewing certified products, for example, very visibly. So I am seeing that probably more than I'm seeing any other type of certification. There are, other types of terms or certifications related to sustainability. GOTS certified cotton is probably the most aggressive type of organic cotton certification that you would see, followed by there's something called the Better Cotton Initiative, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's organic, but it does pass more rigorous environmental tests or processes than traditional conventional cotton. So people will write on their website that they're a part of BCI or Better Cotton Initiative. But long story short, there sadly is not a like sort of one-stop certification that everybody feels comfortable using. Second, to answer your second question, to the market actually remains a part of the relationship with the retailer and the supplier. So we're not a pure broker or marketplace where we would connect them and step away. We actually stay involved and actually are responsible for the supplier, meaning that when Target, and Target is a client, when Target gives a purchase order to us, it is to the market. It's not necessarily to the specific supplier. We're then able to oversee the manufacturing and delivery for Target, working with our supplier that they've chosen.
Thanks. Along those lines, what are the revenue streams or single stream for to the market?
Revenue streams, so to the market operates on a cost of goods plus. So the term, sort of the industry term for a product, when you're looking at the product coming out of the facility, is what are your cost of goods? So when I say cost of goods plus, if Target comes to us and asks us to produce something, we then ask a facility what their pricing is. And let's say they say it's $3 a unit. To the market would then add a markup. So we would say to Target, okay, for us to produce this on your behalf with this supplier, it's going to cost you $4 a unit. So that is our, 99.9% of our revenue stream is the production of product. We do have obviously the book that we recently released is actually, I put it in the business's name. And so that brings in additional revenue, but 99.9% of our business is simply a cost of goods plus market.
Hello, thank you for your time today. I have a question surrounding price sensitivity. I think most people in this room would like to buy more ethically sourced products, but there is a limit to what we're willing to spend. I wonder if there's market research surrounding where that magical percentage is in various fields.
Helder, feel free to jump in, but I would, my 2 cents would be being a conscious consumer doesn't necessarily have to cost you more, and sometimes it can save you money. And this is something I talk about in the book, By the Change, is that there are little hacks that can save you money or that don't cost a thing. So just a handful to list some of my favorites. One is that I buy in bulk. Which sounds like simple, but it makes a big difference. So instead of buying, 5 bags of peanuts or, popcorn, whatever it is, I literally will go to the bulk section of any conventional grocery store and literally use those like pull tabs and put product in a bag instead of buying 5 individual packages. So that not only saves me money because they're less expensive, but it's also less packaging that I'm putting in the landfill. And second would be I take a reusable coffee cup with me everywhere, and I take a refillable water bottle with me everywhere. So as Helder said, I'm in the middle of a book launch, and I'm traveling more than I've probably ever traveled before, at least domestically. And I am constantly in an airport or at a train station or, not at my house. And so when I have my own coffee cup, for example, almost every single coffee shop gives me a discount because I'm using my own cup. And then certainly being able to refill my water bottle in the airport versus buying like a $7 water bottle is a huge money saver. So those are just a few. There's a lot in the book, everything from like saying no to tissue when you're buying clothes to telling your food delivery that you don't need all those napkins in place, like, all the utensils that they stick at the bottom of the bag. There are lots of things that we can do to be more conscious consumers that are just a function of us tweaking our behavior, and they usually are either going to cost nothing or save money.
The only thing I would add to that is we have to change our math when it comes to cost, because we have tended to just think of the out-of-pocket cost at that moment of consumption versus the lifetime cost of that consumption. And so when you start looking at the lifetime cost of that consumption, it adds up. It's more expensive than you think. So I think we have another question back here.
In your eyes, what does a startup in the main traction-based industries of food and beverage, beauty, and fashion need to do to make themselves known when trapped into selling at market price?
Sorry, say the last part of your question again. I got everything until like the last phrase.
How do these startups make a name for themselves when being trapped into selling at market price?
When they're being trapped into selling at market price?
Yeah.
Who do you feel like is trapping you?
Consumers not wanting to pay more.
Wanting to pay more. Okay. Sometimes it's a function of taking a smaller margin. There are then would be traditionally ideal. If you want to grow as a business aggressively, your primary focus as a startup is top line revenue growth, meaning like you are getting new sales, and margin is secondary to that. And sometimes that means that you have to take a much smaller margin, meaning that you are having to, price your product closer to a conventional product and take a small margin so that you can grow market share. And as you grow market share, you can either increase your price because now consumers are willing to engage with you, or you have economies of scale where you can grow your margin that way. But sometimes it takes just being okay with the fact that you're going to make a 10% margin or even a 5% margin as you're growing your business and introducing your brand. If you cannot do that, if that's not possible, then you have to articulate to consumers as clearly as possible why it's worth paying a premium price for the product. And I don't know what your product is. Feel free to get my information from Helder, and I'm happy to talk to you about it. But if you can't convince a consumer that you're worthy, like that you're a luxury good, and depending on what the product is, that you're going to have a better outcome, then the value proposition might be flawed. But I'm happy to talk offline.
Yeah, that's where I was going, is to sort of really look at your value proposition and say, what am I really solving a pain beyond economic for this particular consumer, right? Any other questions? I had a question while we're waiting for if anyone has a last question. There was a question earlier about certification, and I feel like that's a double-edged sword. I feel like unless there is sort of an agreement by a lot of major industry players to commit to developing a set of standards that everybody's going to play by, it actually creates confusion to have so many different kinds of certifications. And I kind of want your opinion on that, your experience with that. And I think that creates confusion both at the company level, right, at the client level, as well as the consumer level. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, competing certifications can be tough in the sense that, even for suppliers, if they're trying to work with, a handful of clients and each of them has a different certification that they want the supplier to go through, it can get really time intensive. And it can get expensive because most certifications cost money. Like to be fair trade certified, like you have to pay to even go through the process, even if they ultimately reject you. So that can get really frustrating really quickly. I do think that it can be confusing for the consumer if there isn't a clear articulation of what a certification means. And so, for example, probably the most certified industry that I can think of is coffee. You could pick up a bag of coffee, and I actually love to see all the certifications, but it's almost comical because you can pick up a bag of coffee and see 8 certifications on the back, and some of them are so specific. Literally, bird friendly is one of the certifications you can have for coffee, meaning that you're not hurting birds' habitats in the way that you're growing the coffee and harvesting the coffee. That it can get a little bit like Portlandia, which is a hilarious show that did a really funny sketch about how we as this next generation of consumers care so deeply about where our products are coming from.
And Jane, having lived in Portland, it's a documentary. Go ahead.
Yes, Portlandia, I recommend it to everybody. So I would say that it is definitely a double-edged sword. I think, where it can be a pro is when that certifying organization, which is a third-party organization, invests in messaging to both the suppliers, to the clients who might request it, and to consumers as to why the certification matters and why we should even look for that seal.
Yeah.
And what it means.
I'm sorry?
And what it means.
And what it means.
What does it mean?
And one of the things that triggered that is I had one of the projects I worked on at Target was in the food and beverage space, and just what are we making claims about, and does it even matter to the consumer? And I think one of the points that we realized was we can claim a lot more than the consumer cares about. So it's really sort of goes back to understanding the value proposition and what really resonates with the consumer. And that's what you want to emphasize. Understanding that part of the job of a certification might be education as well, right? That you're helping educate the consumer to look for a certain element in a product to feel safer, to feel more comfortable with making that purchase. But there's more certifications out. It is a messy minefield right now, and it'd be great to have a little bit more alignment, I think, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Yep. I think we're done. Thank you, Jane, for your time. Appreciate it.
A special thank you to Jane and Holder for a wonderful presentation today. And on behalf of Eller Center for International Business, thank you for joining us.